There's a certain moment in every person's life where something inside them whispers, I should have seen that coming. And usually, when people say that, they're talking about a person, not an event. A person who lied, a person who played them, a person who used silence or charm or confusion to control the dynamic in ways they only realized in hindsight. And that's really where today's journey begins. Because dark psychology isn't just a collection of tricks. It isn't TikTok red flags. And it definitely isn't some mystical ability only certain people have. What psychologists have learned through decades of research is far simpler and far more unsettling. Welcome back to Planting Thoughts, where we dig deep into the ideas that shape how we think, how we feel, and how we act. Today, we're stepping into the shadows of the human mind. We're talking about the hidden strategies manipulators use to get what they want, the subtle tricks, the psychological games, and the ways most of us unknowingly play right into their hands. But here's the twist. By understanding these dark tactics, you can stop being a pawn in someone else's game and maybe even use that insight to protect, persuade, and thrive in your own life. This episode is about why manipulators win and how you can stop playing their game. Now, manipulation works not because manipulators are some kind of super powerful, all enlightened being, right? It just works because humans, like you, are really predictable. And the entire study of dark psychology is essentially the study of how predictable we really are, especially when emotions enter the equation. So today, I'm going to take you into the psychology of manipulation, deception, coercion, psychological vulnerability, but not in a fear-based way, in a clarity-based way. Because once you understand the science behind why some people lie, why some people get lied to, why certain personalities are almost always magnetic, and why some are magnetic to those manipulative personalities, something shifts in you. You stop seeing people's actions through emotion and you start seeing them through patterns. And patterns are predictable. Patterns are protectable. Now, let's start at the beginning. The part that most people skip, the science of lying, not the Hollywood version, the neurological and cognitive one. For years, researchers believed that lying was just a moral problem. You were either an honest person or a dishonest person, right? But then brain imaging studies began to reveal something else. Lying lights up the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive functioning, far more than truth telling. And one of the reasons is that lying requires what psychologists call response inhibition. You have to suppress the truth, hold the lie, predict the consequences, manage your face, manage your tone, and monitor the reaction of the person in front of you, all within milliseconds. And that's why, and this is supported by multiple controlled studies, the truth is shorter and lies are longer. The truth is a memory. A lie is a construction site, baby. And here's the detail people rarely talk about. Liars unconsciously avoid what researchers call psychological ownership. They use fewer I statements. They avoid sensory detail. They avoid timeline specifics. Because the more concrete a statement is, the more it can be checked. And the human brain, when lying, instinctively tries to leave as few fingerprints as possible. As few as possible. But deception on its own isn't manipulation, right? Manipulation is when deception becomes strategy. And the people who manipulate don't all look the same, right? It could be a tiny little girl In fact, the three profiles most strongly associated with manipulative behavior, based on decades and decades of peer reviewed research, almost never overlap in real life the way people think. There's narcissism, right? This isn't rooted in confidence. It's rooted in a fragile self-worth and a constant fear of shame. Narcissists manipulate to protect their ego from collapse. Then we've got Machiavellianism, which is less emotional, more strategic, right? These are people who plan, calculate, right? They charm, they observe, they adjust. They manipulate not out of panic, but out of purpose. And then there's psychopathy, not the Hollywood version, right? But the clinical one. Emotional blunting, shallow affect, reward driven impulsivity. Psychopaths manipulate because consequences don't register for them the same way they do for everyone else, right? Different routes, different motives, same outcome. All these things have one thing in common: control. But even with these personality profiles, manipulation still wouldn't work if humans didn't have predictable psychological vulnerabilities. And this is where the research starts to get really kind of uncomfortable, because the most effective manipulation techniques aren't invented, they're discovered, meaning manipulators find the blind spots we all kind of naturally have. Take intermittent reinforcement, for instance, right? One of the most powerful behavior mechanisms ever identified, right? It's the exact principle behind slot machines. What happens is you get rewarded inconsistently and the brain becomes obsessed. Now, in relationships, this looks like the person who gives affection inconsistently, attention inconsistently, reassurance inconsistently. And because the reward is unpredictable, the attachment becomes stronger, not weaker. You don't need to overdo it with people to get them hooked. In fact, you should withhold a bit. Now, this isn't to say that those types of relationships are healthy, because the uncertainty activates the dopamine system associated with anticipation, right? That's addiction. And the problem is, you're not just addicted to them, you're addicted to wondering about them. Another major vulnerability is something researchers call cognitive load discrepancy. Basically, the tendency for people to basically accept explanations that don't really make a lot of sense when they're under a lot of emotional stress. And the reason is because, I don't know, their bandwidth, right? Their mental bandwidth has been depleted. And like, honestly, this is why, manipulators create confusion, right? It's not accidental, right? It's control. Confusion is control. If they can keep you off balance, never sort of knowing what to expect, whether you're going to withhold of affection, whether you're going to give affection, whether you're going to come at them, whether you're going to be absent, right? That's control. And this also, goes along with something we call gaslighting, right? I mean, this is kind of one of those buzzwords out there, right? Unfortunately, online, gaslighting is the new word for pretty much everything. But, real gaslighting, clinically speaking, is not someone disagreeing with you. It's not someone invalidating you. Real gaslighting requires intentionality and a pattern of altering someone's perception of themselves until they rely on the manipulator as the external source of truth. Now, studies on intimate partner dynamics show that real gaslighting works by mixing small truths with distortions, because pure lies are, they're too easy to reject, right? So what they do is they mix truth and distortion, and it destabilizes your internal compass. Problem is, once you stop trusting your internal compass, you start borrowing theirs. And then there's triangulation, another tactic strongly associated with high narcissistic traits. This is when someone basically introduces a third party, a friend, an ex, something like that. not to cheat, but to destabilize you, to make you compete for attention, to make you earn reassurance. And the science behind it is fascinating. Research on social comparison shows that the human stress response elevates dramatically when a valued relationship is threatened by a third party. It's not jealousy, it's actually just survival coding. But maybe the most powerful form of manipulation is the quietest one. And this is something psychologists call withdrawal based control, the silent treatment, the disappearing act, the deliberate withholding of emotional connection, not because they're busy, not because they need time, but because withholding connection forces the anxious system into activation. And activated people are compliant people. Now, what's wild is that this exact pattern has been documented in both infant attachment studies and even in adult relationships. Basically, what happens is when a caregiver goes silent or unpredictable, the child would become hypervigilant, right? And hypervigilance is adaptive for survival, but it's destructive for adulthood. And that brings us to the part most people don't realize. Your attachment style determines your susceptibility to manipulation. People with anxious attachment, due to like, I don't know, maybe early experiences with inconsistent caregiving or something like that, right? They are more sensitive to threat cues in relationships. Research consistently shows they experience higher cognitive fusion, meaning their thoughts and emotions blend in ways that make self distancing harder. Right? They're more likely to reinterpret harmful behavior, right, as normal or even deserved. Right? These are truly broken people all of the time. Then you have the avoidant individuals, often shaped by emotionally distant caregiving. They minimize their needs so aggressively that they often overlook manipulation entirely because acknowledging it would require vulnerability. Their blind spot is actual emotional minimization. And then there's the disorganized attachment, linked in research to chaotic or frightening, early environments, right? And they basically come with conflicting strategies that make boundaries extremely difficult, right? The push pull dynamic is heightened, and manipulators exploit that unpredictability. But here's the moment where the script shifts, because this is where most people stop. They focus on the darkness, right? But psychology keeps going. Psychology also studies what makes a person resistant to manipulation. One of the biggest factors is what researchers call self concept clarity. The degree to which your beliefs about yourself are stable, consistent, and internally generated rather than externally shaped. People with high self concept clarity, they don't argue about who they are, they don't negotiate their reality. And manipulators can't destabilize someone who doesn't outsource their identity. Another protective factor is emotional granularity, the ability to describe your internal experience with precision. Instead of, I'm upset, it becomes, I'm disappointed. Instead of, I'm nervous, it becomes, I'm anticipating conflict. High granularity reduces emotional reactivity, which reduces manipulability. And studies show that people who can label their emotions accurately experience lower amygdala activation and higher prefrontal cortex regulation. And we all know we want good decision making and less fear. Boundaries, too, right? These things have a neurological basis. When you say no and you mean it, you activate the same neural circuits involved in self preservation. It's not metaphorical, it's biological. People who are consistent with boundaries literally strengthen the neural pathways that protect them from coercion. And here's something that shocked even seasoned researchers. One of the strongest predictors of manipulation resistance is the ability to tolerate social discomfort. Manipulators rely on your fear of appearing rude, unkind, confrontational. If you can tolerate a moment of awkward silence, you break half their power just like that. And so we land here, the slow, steady climb of everything I've shared with you. Right at the ridge, right at that line of simple truth. You don't become manipulation proof by becoming suspicious. You become manipulation proof by becoming anchored, anchored in your self concept, anchored in emotional vocabulary, anchored in your boundaries, anchored in your ability to delay your reaction. It's tough sometimes. Anchored in your ability to sit in discomfort without panicking. Because the moment you stop reacting instantly, manipulators lose their timing. The moment you stop chasing reassurance, they lose their leverage. The moment you stop explaining yourself 3 times, they lose their script. And the moment you stop outsourcing your reality, they lose their access. You don't beat dark psychology by fighting darkness. You beat it by removing the shadows inside yourself that someone else can exploit. It's like everything else I teach you here on Planting Thoughts. You have got to become strong internally. When you do that, something subtle but profound happens. You stop being a character in someone else's strategy and you start becoming an author of your own mind. Unfortunately, here's the part most people never hear, right? Because now that we've spotted manipulation, and everyone really wants to know how to spot manipulation, but how do we actually use these principles for good? So we talked about how manipulators use these things for evil. And we talked about how you could kind of defend yourself against them, but how can you use some of these tactics to actually do some good in the world? Because almost no one talks about how to use these underlying principles for good, right? To protect yourself, to communicate clearly, influence ethically, right? Here's the truth. Most psychological mechanisms get abused by manipulators. They're actually neutral tools, and they only really become dark when someone uses them without empathy or consent. So let's talk about how to use these same mechanisms to make your life better, not darker. Number one, the power of framing. Use it to create clarity, not confusion. Manipulators weaponize framing by distorting reality, but good communicators use framing to create understanding. I mean, research from the Stanford Mental Models Lab, Stanford, right? We're talking the gold standard here, right? They show that the way you frame an issue changes how someone's brain encodes the information. Not because they're being manipulated, but because humans organize meaning through context. So instead of saying, "Why don't you ever listen to me?" A healthy frame would be, "Here's what I'm trying to understand, and here's what I need." Same psychological method, same psychological mechanism. One destroys trust, one builds it. Changing the frame isn't manipulation, it's giving the other person a handle they can actually grasp. Number two, pattern recognition. It's like, I don't know, your early warning system, right? Manipulators rely on predictability. They bank on the fact that most people don't notice patterns. But if you use pattern recognition ethically, you become someone who sees the emotional weather before the storm hits. The University of Chicago's Center for Decision Research found that people who consciously track interaction patterns, tone shifts, withdrawal cycles, pressure points, things like this, right? They're significantly more resilient in conflict. You can use this skill too. Sense when someone is overwhelmed. Adjust your timing in difficult situations or conversations. Break your own defensive cycles. Avoid escalating situations that don't need fire. This is influence, but it's not manipulation. It's emotional intelligence at high resolution, and that's what we bring here. Number three is mirroring, right? We've talked about mirroring before, but it's really about strengthening the connection instead of exploiting it, right? Manipulators mirror you to get you to trust them faster, right? Therapists, negotiators, and emotionally secure people also mirror ethically to make communication easier. A meta analysis in personality and social psychology review found that mirroring increases empathy, it reduces conflict, and it helps people feel understood as long as it's done transparently and it needs to be reciprocal. The last part is key. Reciprocity equals ethical, secrecy equals manipulation. So instead of mirroring someone to win them, right? Mirror them to meet them. You match their pace, not their wounds. Number four, the truth bias and how to use it for good. Now, one wild sort of piece of research from deception research is that humans are wired with a truth bias, meaning we naturally assume people are telling the truth. Manipulators exploit this, but you can use this. Build psychological safety, lower defense walls in conversations, repair relationships after conflict, make your boundaries easier to accept. I mean, when you lead with sincerity, research shows that the other person's mirror neuron system activates in kind. You're not manipulating, you're modeling emotional clarity so the other person feels safe enough to be real. Being honest is an influence strategy, a powerful one. Number five, emotional calibration, the ethical replacement for emotional manipulation. Instead of guilt tripping, use timing. Instead of love bombing, use clarity. Instead of withholding affection, use consistency. Calibrating your emotional tone is not manipulation. It's what the Harvard Negotiation Project calls creating the conditions for cooperation. People respond better when they know you're steady, you mean what you say, you communicate pain without punishment. You're not trying to win, you're trying to understand. Good emotional calibration builds trust faster than any manipulative technique that they could try to teach you. Manipulators push people off balance. Ethical communicators, they help people find the center. Number six, using high resolution listening to influence outcomes. There's a concept in research called active inference. Your brain constantly predicts what the other person will say next. Now, manipulators hijack this by creating confusion, right? That thing we talked about earlier. But you can actually use active inference to reduce confusion. When you listen deeply, you start hearing what they're actually afraid of, what they're trying to protect, what they're not saying but desperately want to. The emotional wound behind the behavior, right? Once you can name the real pattern, influence becomes simple. Not force, not pressure, just truth with compassion. Now that's ethical power. And then finally, number seven, the boundary mirror. This is probably the most ethical influence tool you have. Most manipulators hate boundaries because boundaries make manipulation impossible. But here's the twist, boundaries don't only protect you, they influence the behavior of everyone around you. Now, there was this study by the University of Tennessee's Interpersonal Dynamics Lab, right? And they found that clear boundaries actually improve partner behavior more than persuasion, reasoning, or reassurance. And the reason's pretty simple. Boundaries show people who you are, right? Manipulation hides who you are. Boundaries stabilize relationships. Manipulation destabilizes it, right? When you say, here's what I can do and here's what I can't, you're using the same psychological mechanisms manipulators use: influence, expectation setting, and emotional leverage. But you're applying it with honesty instead of deception. You're not controlling anyone. you're calibrating the relationship to truth. This is ethical power, the kind that lasts, the kind that makes people around you feel safer, not smaller. If you enjoyed this episode of Planting Thoughts and the Psychology of Dark Manipulation, hit that like, subscribe, or leave a comment and let us know what you did to help stop some manipulator in your life. I'm Mike. I've had a great time. I love you all. Peace.